has a big effect on the incentives that people in the company have. So one way that a company can be funded is just the person puts in their own money, right? And that's the main source for very small companies that intend to stay very small. So like a little mom and pop store is usually funded out of the money that that person has, or maybe a bank loan. It's also quite common for very rich individuals, right? So if people are very rich, they can just start a company with their own money. A second form of funding is friends and family. You can get your friends or family members to give you some money to help start the company. And this is a common thing for early stage startup companies that are planning to get big but are just getting started. Venture capital is the next stage that a startup company usually goes through, which is that there's some private equity investor who is someone who knows something about the industry in which you're thinking about getting involved, and who is dedicated to giving out money, equity investments to people like you. And eventually they hope to get their money back by selling off the stock to a public equity market. Bank loans are another way to be financed. Public equity, which is usually the way that the venture capitalists recoup their money, is quite costly, because you usually need an intermediary like an investment bank to help you sell to the public. And finally, corporate bonds are similarly quite costly because you have to sell to the public. Okay, so the problem set, actually problem number 2, really asks you to explore some of the incentive properties of these different ways of a company to be funded. But let's quickly go through some of the ups and downs. Well, personal capital obviously has no principal agent problem, as I think Chanel said. But the problem is that often you don't have very much money yourself. And this is the reason why it usually is only the way of funding something that a business that's planning to stay small, or one that's created by a large, wealthy person who has the ability to fund a large business. Friends and family financing has a lot of the benefits of the personal financing because you really care about your reputation and what your friends think of you and getting them their money back. But again, you may not have friends that have that much money, you may not have family that has that much money, and so it's a limit on your ability to access them. Venture capital has a lot of benefits. It's very easy for venture capitalists who's an expert on your company to monitor you and to make sure you're doing a good job. And it's often possible to develop a personal relationship that helps among some of the softer incentives. But it can create a lot of risk for the person who's funding you because they have so much invested in you specifically. And again, any given venture capitalist may have a small pool of capital. On the problem set, I'll ask you to explore the trade-offs between venture capital and debt. But an interesting issue is the pros and cons of bank loans versus public bonds. So a benefit of a bank loan is that it's easier to have you, and you usually don't put any restrictions on yourself. Another benefit of a bank is that they can actually come in if you start to go bankrupt and make sure that the bankruptcy isn't too costly, that you negotiate some way out of it. But the problem of that is, given that you know that the bankruptcy isn't going to be too unpleasant, you might not work that hard to avoid it. And so one advantage of the public bonds is a way of saying, look, I know bankruptcy is going to be terrible, so I'm going to work really hard not to go bankrupt. Okay. So given all of these problems that arise within companies, a natural question is why we have companies at all. Why don't we just let the market do everything? So what do I mean by that? Well, imagine a GM assembly plant. The whole plant doesn't need to be made up of employees of GM, right? You could potentially subcontract the installation of the tires to one other company, and subcontract the installation of the paint to another company, and of the bolts to another company, right? Now this might seem a little bit unrealistic, but think about things at University of Chicago, right? Look at the Reynolds Club. There's just a ton of people serving food there, and none of them are really the University of Chicago itself, right? And that happens with tech support in many areas. It happens with legal services in many areas. Increasingly large parts of companies are getting outsourced to other companies, right? So economists would often say, you know, why don't you just ship everything outside of the company? Companies are very command and control, and if economists don't believe in centralized planning and believe more in markets, why isn't everything just done by a market? And questions like this are called boundaries of the firm question. Why are some things inside of a company and other things outside of a company? And that's what I'm going to talk about for the last 15 minutes. So there are three prominent theories of why we have some things inside and some things outside of companies. One is Coase's theory of transaction costs, which basically says that there's some costs associated with using a market, like you have to negotiate and enforce the contractual relationships that you have, and maybe pay taxes on them. And there's some costs of doing things within companies, which is that you have to manage the people and you have all these principal agent problems that I was talking about. And that the optimal, size of a company balances these two considerations. Oliver Williamson sort of built on this to say that in particular, if we are interacting with one another a lot, and if it's really uncertain what I'm going to need you to do for me, then it makes sense for me to hire you. Because it's going to be too costly to constantly be negotiating with you, constantly telling you all these different things that you need to do in negotiating a contract. It's better for me to just employ you. Similarly, if the thing that I'm doing for you only has a value to you, doesn't have a value to anyone else, then it's going to be important that I hire you, because when we negotiate over what the price of that is, once I've created the thing, it's going to be very complicated to figure out what it's worth if there isn't an outside market. And so the more that there are of these, the more attractive it will be for us to integrate into a single firm. Property rights, the property rights theory says instead that you're not going to want to do something for me unless you own me, because you're afraid that, so imagine we're working on a project together for a class. We're collaborating. You might not, that can be very problematic if I put a bunch of effort into doing something and then you claim it was you that did the work. If nobody else on the outside could tell who it was that did the work, right, then often working together, unless I'm directly hiring you, can be problematic, because someone can claim to have done the work even though they didn't, and therefore they can basically get held up. The other person can get all the benefits, and they don't end up getting any of the increase. There's lots of other reasons as well that a company might be together or separate. So it might be useful for everyone to be in the same building so you can monitor someone. It might be useful to be able to talk more easily with one another and more freely. Having an Apple store be an Apple store rather than a separate store might be valuable because it gets people to think of Apple, and I have this loyalty to Apple and I believe in the Apple name and so forth. It also might be useful for them not to also be selling Microsoft products, so people aren't conflicted in terms of what to sell to consumers. They just push the Apple product all the time. And yet, for almost all these problems I described, there's ways that you can deal with them without actually making things into one company, by just having the right types of contracts. So for example, to avoid lots of negotiations, you could have a long-term relationship with someone. So I don't know if anyone here has ever been like a real regular at a restaurant and went there every week. Now it's true, if you have a personal chef, that personal chef might be willing to make what you want more specifically than a restaurant would. But if you develop a real personal relationship with someone running a restaurant, usually they're pretty darn flexible and they'll make for you pretty much whatever you want in order to keep your business. And so in that case, you might actually think that the more time we spend interacting, the less important it is to have a personal chef, right? Because a personal chef might be needed if I just want to have someone 1 or 2 times make exactly what I like. But if I have a long-term relationship with a restaurant, they might be willing to accommodate my interests. Second, in terms of exclusivity, many parts suppliers have an exclusive relationship that they only supply parts to one automaker rather than to a lot of automakers. And the reason that they don't, and they might not become part of the same company, they might just have this exclusive supply relationship. Now, one important reason why that becomes difficult is that there's antitrust laws that make it hard to have those sorts of exclusive contracts. Third, if you think about like company towns, for example, Hyde Park is basically a company town for the University of Chicago. A lot of things are really physically close, and so it may not be that important to actually have all of the restaurants in the company town or all of the apartment buildings in the company town literally owned, because effectively they're owned by the person who runs the company town. So one example of that is that Microsoft in Redmond, Washington, has an independent gym. But this independent gym doesn't have a single customer who isn't from Microsoft. They have a special Microsoft rate, which is basically the only rate that anyone ever uses, because it's like 7 times as expensive if you're not a Microsoft employee. So basically, this might as well be the company gym, but effectively, it's independent, but it really isn't independent at all. Did you have a question? No. Oh, okay. Another example, I think, is Mac Apartments here in Hyde Park, right? I mean, Mac Apartments is a different company. It has no relationship to the University of Chicago. But I'll tell you, if Mac Apartments tries to do anything the University of Chicago doesn't like, they're going to be in big trouble, right? Because the University of Chicago owns all the land and just leases it to Mac, right? And they can just take it back at any time if Mac does something they don't want. So effectively, they own Mac Apartments, even though they like to say that they're a separate entity, right? And so I think that what this leads us to think about is whether it really matters what is inside or outside of a company, right? I mean, it's definitely the case that things that are formally, if we have a very close relationship, it often makes sense for us to become the same company. But there are many things that you can do inside of a company that you can also do with people who are outside of a company. And there are a bunch of factors that I just went through that would lead you to put some things inside of a company and other things outside of a company. And these are all quite different and not necessarily that related to one another. And any one of these individual things you can almost certainly solve without becoming part of the same company. And therefore, it may not really matter that much. Or it may matter on a very case-by-case basis, whether things are literally part of the same company or whether they're literally outside of the company. And so the way I tend to view things is that a firm or company is really sort of just a convenient fiction. It's a convenient model for us to think about things. And often it will make sense for us to take one legal company and think of it as many different sub-companies which represent the individuals who are in conflict within that company. And other times it'll make sense for us to take a bunch of things that are legally different companies and think of them as one firm, even though they're not. Because what really matters is the economic relationships and not whether it's formally called one company or many companies. So what we really mean by a firm is sort of a cluster of people and things, not necessarily a legal company, which we can think reasonably of as maximizing its total profit, at least for the purposes that we're considering. And starting on Tuesday, we're going to get, from a mathematical perspective, into thinking about how firms do go about maximizing their profit. And